Hi, welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, the State Treasurer has sued the Gaming Board. Rob McCord, Pennsylvania State Treasurer, will explain. And then Bill DeWeese, he is under criminal indictment for public corruption. He got renominated to his legislative seat. He will be in the House to explain how that occurred. Pennsylvania politics, in depth and in detail. And guess what? It all starts right now.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Hi, welcome back to the program. Well, we have an action-packed show. Rob McCord, the Pennsylvania State Treasurer, is sitting right across from me. And Treasurer McCord, I want to tell you, a lot of us were stunned that you filed this lawsuit against the Pennsylvania Gaming Board. And quite frankly, you have some good arguments. So let's talk about. First of all, why did you sue them? What was an issue here?
I mean, it's very straightforward. We got to have the law honored. People very appropriately have skepticism about government in general right now, and certainly about gaming, gambling, and the Gaming Board. And for months, many months, we'd been reaching out saying, look, the treasurer is an ex officio member, and by the way, ex officio is just a fancy Latin. It just means by virtue of the office.
But with no vote.
With no vote, which frankly makes it even better for auditing the practices.
Okay, so you're supposed to do, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have nothing to do with who gets the license. That's not my interest.
Or the regulations of the
My
Gaming
interest
Board.
is to make sure that the process is fair and that it's efficient, because at the end of the day, the public took a risk. I mean, these licenses and the potential sort of external problems that can occur from any increase in gambling, that's the public placing a bet and an investment.
What were they doing that you...
First, they said that the treasurer wasn't allowed in any executive sessions. And I said, you know, that I basically got in a very heated and prolonged argument, and they kept contradicting themselves.
You got into a you're such a nice guy.
Yeah, I know. And I actually liked several of the people who happened to be on the Gaming Board. Right, exactly. But I just said, this is absurd. And then it was like, you know, I said send over the confidentiality agreement. That wasn't a problem. But I wanted to make sure I had it appropriately vetted so that if there were things that the public should know, I didn't want to be signing.
So let me go through this and make so.
Yeah.
You're an ex officio member of the Gaming Board. They would not let you in certain meetings, the executive committee, where
and
they're
so
done
they started to relent on that, and they said, but your designee is not allowed in. Well, I serve on 18 boards, and in every situation you're allowed to send your designee, but particularly in areas where you need substantial domain expertise. You need experts. And the Teachers Pension Fund Board meeting often was at the exact same time. Now, we're talking $40 to $50 billion. I'm a business leader. I love doing the investment work.
Legally responsible. You're the state. I mean, you know, that's your job, right?
So you know, you can't have a Hobson's choice, right? You know, I mean, so I wanted to be able to send my designee. At no point did they concede the obvious that was obviously legal, and so it just became time to sue. And you know, I hope we resolve it without having to go to court. But you know, I know we're doing the right thing.
So they wanted you then to sign a confidentiality agreement, which meant that whatever took place there, you would keep in confidence because.
Well, and to be clear,
am I misunderstanding that?
You might be misunderstanding a little. I never had a problem with the confidentiality agreement.
So you'd
as long
sign
ago
and
as
say
last February,
keep it
I
quiet.
said send it over. You know, the kind of nuance here is they said, well, if we were ready for him to come over to the meeting. We had the document prepared. It's like, no. You know, I've seen some pretty bad staff work done, and I needed to make sure my staff vetted the confidentiality agreement. But that frankly was only one issue. The other was to be sure, and they kept contradicting themselves as to whether or not I was allowed into the executive session. But in addition to that, equally important, I needed to be able to have my senior staff attend on my behalf, and at no point, either in writing or verbally, had they conceded that. And
so where does all this stand?
We have a lawsuit. It'll start to be resolved over the summer.
And they're not. They have not relented yet.
They've sent over the confidentiality agreement for us to review, but they haven't, which is fine. But that's only the first step. We need to make sure our designee gets in, and we'll have conversations. And I want to be clear. I work hard to disagree without being disagreeable. I'm not here to villainize people. I just think there's appropriate skepticism on the public's behalf about gaming, and I'm the only statewide duly elected public representative on that board.
Now, when they're in open session, there's no issue because the press and everybody is there. So. Your point is that, and you've gone, are you allowed, I mean, as ex officio, do you have any other sort of proprietary right? Are you allowed to speak during the court?
The law is that anything that isn't explicitly prohibited, you have the exact same role. I'm an, quote, ex officio member also over at the Teachers Pension Fund Board, but because they don't say can't vote on X or Y, and I like that I cannot vote, by the way, because it makes it very clear. It gives me an arm's length distance from the, quote, licensees. I have nothing to do with that.
Good point.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to talking about pensions, the $4 billion, the $5 billion, you pick a number somewhere in between. We have a huge pension problem in the state. Treasurer McCord has some thoughts about how that might be resolved. Pennsylvania Newsmakers returns following these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania Cyber Charter School, bringing educational innovation and freedom to the children of Pennsylvania. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by PAConstructionJobs.com. For more information about rewarding careers in the highway construction industry, visit PAConstructionJobs.com. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Hey, welcome back to the program. Well, you know, in all fairness, if somebody from the gaming board, we're neutral here, if somebody from the gaming board wants to come on and explain their position, we're more than happy. We'd love to have them on. All right, let's talk about the pension problem. We have two big pension systems, one state employees, one teachers. We'll forget the third, the municipal pensions. That's a morass that we don't have enough time to get into. But somewhere between $4 and $5 billion now are owed, that these pensions are what they call in debt, and whatever that happens to mean at any given time. And all of this comes due within the next 2 years in some fashion.
Exactly. I mean, what sort of
flesh that out?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I want to be very clear. As a statewide official, the McCord Treasury wants to increase the retirement security for all Pennsylvanians. So I'm very concerned about every working Pennsylvanian out there and how well funded their pensions are. One of the chronic issues that's erupting in the state budget, but that's only a small piece of the world, is that they have chronically underfunded the two large state pension funds. So it's always bad, and we've seen kids do this with fresh credit cards when they go out and spend money and they don't pay their bills on an almost monthly basis. So
one of the ways was that there was no employer contribution, or a very low employer contribution rate, for the good part of the early years of this century into the state system.
It's basically been a bad decade.
SERS.
The State Employee Retirement System, SERS, and the Teachers Retirement System, with the acronym is PESERS. And my mom was a teacher. I care deeply about these issues, and I care deeply just about people having a safe retirement. Like, people who've worked hard and played by the rules their whole life.
Absolutely.
Shouldn't, when they're physically frail, face a situation where they have to worry about whether or not they're going to be able to buy medication, buy food, and pay their rent. And so there are several things going on. First of all, some agreements were signed in the early 2000s, and they kept playing with the math and the actuarial assumptions. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but it was very sloppy. So I'm trying, to a certain extent, to become professor pension, not to get too deep into the politics, just to say, let's understand the real facts. So just so you understand the scale of this, they've accrued just for existing employees, even if people step forward and say, well, we'll have reduced benefits for future employees, which is the only thing that's legally allowable.
I understand.
Right? They've accrued a $46 billion tab, is one way of thinking about it. That is if we continue to be able to invest at an 8% return from here forward, which is, a pretty high goal, pretty high standard. Now, as a former investor, we can do that. But they have a $46 billion bill, and they're saying, well, we don't want to up our contribution rate at the state level too much. You're talking about,
well, first of all, the state's budget situation's horrendous.
Exactly.
And if they've got to put 8 or 10% for each employee's gross salary into a pension, we're going to have another kind of problem.
Right,
Go ahead.
exactly. And I'm enjoying, frankly, working on a bipartisan basis with very smart people. I mean, Senator Brown is a very smart Republican senator who's chair of the Finance Committee. We serve together on the Peasers Pension Fund. We disagree on some things, but we at least know how to look at the math together. I tend to believe that there is a role for defined benefit pension plans. Social Security, after all, is a defined benefit pension plan, because you don't want somebody at 63 to kind of bet wrong on stock markets and suddenly have their retirement security imperiled. But anyway, when it comes to this, part of what I'm arguing is you've been carrying this debt essentially off balance sheet. You know, bring this debt on balance sheet, bring it out into the light of the day. As you ask people to take a look at changing benefits for future employees, you should be bellying up to the bar and saying how you're going to pay your tab. Right now, you know, these are like young people who make, say, $26,000 a year. We have a $26 billion budget, you know, roughly, making $26,000 a year, who have a $46,000 credit card bill, who say, Mom, Dad, the way I'm going to reform my credit card situation is I'm not going to pay more than $400 a year in credit card. And you go, that's not reform.
And especially if the stock market tanks and the investments don't reach the 8%.
And it's harder to make the investments yield a high return when you have an underfunded pension.
Now, we have a minute or two left. In all, you know, we full disclosure on here, as a former professor at Millersville University, I was in one of the pension systems, so I'm obviously an interest in this, but you get it. I'm not going to advocate one way or another. Well, we full disclosure on this program.
Right.
All right, so let's in a minute or so we have left here. Tell me what you want the balance put on. You want the pension liability put in the budget, or at least put in on the books.
Well, several things have to happen simultaneously. First of all, I want to work with legislators and leaders from both parties, so I don't want to jump in too early on politics or a total solution. I think part of the solution is that we start talking about the real size of the tab.
Okay, real size.
Legislators like to talk about, it's a $46 billion problem.
It's not a $4 to $5 billion.
Yeah, it's not. You're right.
That's the immediate concern.
That's the immediate, right.
Okay,
and this rush for cash, and point one is it's a $46 billion problem. How do we face it? Point two is we should be getting more money in earlier, and we've already spent that money when we signed those contracts. So when I'm discussing this with people who say, well, I don't want to borrow and spend, it's you've already spent it. So your question is, are you going to tax and spend or borrow and spend? Now, while debt is cheap, we're at historic lows for bonds. I think over time we can build a bipartisan consensus to use some debt money to make larger contributions, because if you can borrow at 3% and invest at 9%, that's part of the solution, but only a part.
I got it.
And I know there'll be compromises on the benefit side,
I want you to come back. I mean, this is a huge problem that has to be resolved.
Absolutely.
And I think you're on the right target. We've got to fess up to the debt first and deal with it.
And I don't think you roll defined benefits under the bus. I think that those are good things for good people.
All right, Representative DeWeese is coming up. Well, under criminal indictment, he got reelected, and
But Rob McCord is not.
No, Rob McCord is not. Back with Pennsylvania Newsmakers following these words.
Thank you.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the State System of Higher Education. 14 state-owned universities. The state system is the largest provider of higher education in Pennsylvania. And by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, working towards a healthy Pennsylvania.
Hi, welcome back to the program. Well, joining me is Representative Bill DeWeese, mostly from Greene County. I don't want to offend your other constituent representative.
Washington County and Fayette.
And Fayette. We're going to get that out. All right, look, I know there are things about, what obviously will be a trial that you're not going to talk about and don't want to talk about. But I do want to ask you one question about an option or an alternative which the Attorney General might have had. And that came up in a story written by Laura Vesey in the Patriot News. And that is, why not a civil trial Why not a civil trial instead of a criminal trial? Go ahead.
I certainly don't know, Terry, what was going through the AG's thought process or his chief attorneys in the building over at Strawberry Square. But as Laura said, the alternative could have been a civil procedure where people would have paid back the bonuses with interests. And if he and his agents could prove that people did campaign work on government time, they would be fined, and it would have been a civil procedure. So the wide berth of prosecutorial discretion that is available for attorneys general in our nation allowed him maximum flexibility. I certainly think that the unhappy chapter that has been visited upon so many people, not just the 25 people who have been officially brought into this dynamic, but many of the people that were given immunity and were treated with some very aggressive interrogation techniques and so forth. A lot of lives have been altered. A lot of lives have been altered. And it could have been a civil procedure rather than a criminal procedure, but I certainly would not speculate. I respect the Attorney General. I respect the agents, especially the agents. The attorneys were a bit
aggressive.
Gruff. Yes, but again, that's for another day.
Just for our viewers, I mean, we're talking here about the core of these charges against legislators, former legislators and staffers has to do with what they call public corruption, about whether campaign resources were used, state dollars were used to run campaigns. And I think everybody who watches this show is certainly familiar with what's called the bonus gate.
As the media often says, bonus gate. But I just lost my father last Saturday. He passed away. And at least he lived to see me exonerated from the bonus gate dynamics. I was not involved at that at all. And I cooperated for 35 consecutive months and subsequently for the last 6 months. So we're approaching the 41st month of this travail, and I will continue to be respectful of the process.
But you're going to vigorously fight these charges.
Absolutely. I think, really, Terry, I think with the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of charges and the hundreds and hundreds of people that were interviewed and the scores of people who were charged, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, I think that the AG made a mistake in charging Sharon Radovich and myself. And I think that when he said in his presentment that Ms. Radovich had no assignment other than to do politics, that was just way off the bullseye, because there are 100 people willing to come to Harrisburg, and these people were available within days of the indictment. And that will lead me into why I think we won the election.
Do you think,
and when he said we had no campaign apparatus other than the hired hands, that's just fallacious.
So you had folks out in your campaign
in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s with DeWeese T-shirts on, and again,
you mean out in your district campaigning for you?
Absolutely. And I just think there's been a very unhappy mistake that's been made, and I think that Bill Kostopoulos, a very talented and passionate advocate on my behalf, will be able to project that successfully as we work our way through this process. But I want to tell you, I am very respectful of the Attorney General and his lawyers and his agents, especially the agents, the union guys, the blue-collar guys.
Well, I mean, look, we're going to run to break, and when we come back, I want to talk about the campaign. But I mean, I don't think anyone in their right mind would expect that you wouldn't vigorously defend yourself. I mean, why wouldn't any defendant vigorously fight whatever charges, particularly when you're going to trial, and there's little that you can do about that, I guess. So you're going to fight it, which I think most people expect you to do, right?
There's a procedure right now being viewed because the United States Supreme Court is going to hand down an opinion on honest services this summer. That opinion on honest services will have some degree, potentially,
of mitigation,
on the different states' statutory construction of conflict of interest language.
Okay.
So, good Lord only knows what's going to happen.
All right, we're chatting with Bill DeWeese. He's a former Speaker of the House. He's a Democrat in the state legislature. He's in his party's leadership for many years. We'll be back with Representative DeWeese following these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by Highmark Blue Shield, changing the way health plans work for business with a variety of plan options for employers and more choices for employees. Information is available at highmark.com. Have a greater hand in your company's health. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care.
Hey, welcome back to the program, Representative Bill DeWeese. All right, let's talk about, you're out campaigning, you campaigned for months, you run pretty convincingly. Some people were surprised by that and some people weren't.
You mean they were surprised that I worked hard, or
no,
they were surprised
they
that
all
we
know
prevailed?
that you prevailed, particularly by the margin that you did. What were people saying? First of all, what were the voters saying to you when you went out and talked to them?
Well, number one, I don't know one person in the Capitol complex other than my good friends at PSEA and AFSCME who had any faith in me. Mm-hmm. My union record over 34 years, which was unimpeachable and impeccable. I guess that means the same thing, and I'd been at more union microphones, statewide conferences of Teamsters and steelworkers and the AFL-CIO's whole umbrella. But I didn't receive as much help as I wanted and needed from a lot of folks. But nevertheless, when I went back home, I had a pretty favorable reception. I think that and my euphemism for this predicament is this unhappy chapter in my life when it was visited upon me on the 15th of December. Mm-hmm. It took me about a month to decide whether I was going to run again. I mean, I felt like Muhammad Ali had knocked me on the canvas.
So you actually considered not running?
I don't know that I considered not running. I just wanted to postpone a decision. Mm-hmm. I was really, really torn. And then I went back home and had a tough Christmas, but by New Year's things were starting to crystallize. And by mid-January, I had been talked to by so many of my friends and supporters. And Terry,
these are people back in your
that's correct.
In your district.
That's correct. And I represent, just like every other state
60,
legislator,
60,000
people,
yeah.
40,000 in green, and the 20,000 remaining.
So you're out doing door to door.
Oh,
you're
yes.
out doing all these chicken
barbecues.
Yes. The things that legislators do.
34 years later,
yeah.
A veteran legislator knocking on doors. And by mid-February, February 16, when the petitions went out, I started to feel like we had a solid shot. And that's the way I would say it when I would come back to the legislature. And a guy named Vic Shine, who is the former mayor of one of our little boroughs in Greensboro and active in the fire company, active in the Little League, and I'd thrown out the first ball at the Little League several times over my career. He called me on the night of the 16th of February and said, Billy, and it was snowing to beat the band. And he said, Billy, which some of the older guys back home call me, Billy, I took my petition out in the snow, and you know we had 1.5 feet, 2 feet of snow, 28 houses, got 25 signatures.
So in other words, we're about out of time, and if we want to come back, but in other words, when you were there, you heard nothing but support, basically.
No, I wouldn't say that I heard nothing but support, but the most stunning aspect of the dynamic was that in the age of the internet, with all of the presentments, being on the television and on the radio and in the newspaper, we still would go days and days, and people did not talk about Mr. Corbett and Mr. DeWeese.
Great. Thanks for coming on. I know this is not always easy. We'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, you all stay well.